Hello, my name is Ian Pastel, and I'm the product manager for the TIBCO Data Science Team Studio platform. In this demonstration, we're going to look at the use of TDV inside of Team Studio. TDV is a data virtualization platform that is able to connect to various different data sources and to be able to federate and join that data together to create data services which can then be published and consumed either through ODBC, JDBC, or web services. So with the version 7 of Team Studio, we introduced the TIBCO Data Virtualization solution as a way of accessing data. The reason for this is that TDV itself can access a vast variety of different data sources and also allow us to write data back to those data sources. Now, to use the TDV product within Team Studio, we have to do some initial configuration to enable the integration between the two products to work. Here I'm inside of the TIBCO Data Virtualization Studio, and we're going to run the setup processes. This would normally be done either by a data engineer or by a systems administrator, not typically by an end user of Team Studio. So to enable the various services, we have to import a car file, which is available on the e-delivery as part of the product download for Team Studio. You need to place that car file onto the same server as the TDV Studio client, and from there we can then do the import. If you right click on the shared folder and say import, and then browse to the location where the integration car is located, enter the password, which is TIBCO123, and uncheck include policies and privileges so that just data source connections and custom jars are checked. Then hit the import button. This will import a number of services, in this case, for this version 57, into the TDV environment. This will create several resources. This folder, TDS 7.0 integration, has a number of artifacts, including a set of functions that are called by Team Studio when doing integration into TDV. And these are published as a set of RESTful web services. Now, it's very important that you don't change or modify or alter in any way these services for correct operation between Team Studio and TDV. Now, the next stage we have to do is we have to run an initialization procedure, and this will actually do the final setup. There is a configuration here in this object P definitions, which can change that configuration. The first set of parameters, for example, say the folder where the services are, the name of the virtual database we're going to create. In most circumstances, you would not alter these parameters. There are some additional parameters that can be altered later after the installation, for example, the format of strings used for time and dates. So, as I say, normally we wouldn't alter these parameters. We go through and initially run the pinit procedure. So you locate the procedure underneath the functions that we've just imported, open it, and then click the run button. It should report success here. After it's run, we will see that it's now created a virtual database called data with an initial schema in it called compute temp. Now that we've actually created this inside of TDV, we can now try and access that from the Team Studio product. So if we go back into Team Studio and go to data, then we can add a new data source. So select TIBCO Data Virtualization as the type, give it a meaningful name, in this case TDV, and enter the host name of the machine where the TDV server is running. This also will be left as data, and by default the port is 9401. If you've just installed TDV, this is the default port. If your administrator has changed it, you will need to know the details. We need to add one additional parameter. In my case, I don't have SSL set up on this environment, so we need to add a parameter here which tells us not to use it. Finally, we need the login, which will be admin, and whatever password is set up for the admin user by your TDV administrator. You should now better create the data source. And we can now see that if I click into here, we will see that temp schema that we saw back in the TDB Studio. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to allow access to TDV to different sources of data, but also allow us to write back data sets that are created by Team Studio to various different data sources. In what we're going to show next, we use two data sources. We have a Postgres database, which has two schemas, one where we have the input data we want to use, and one where we're going to write back to from Team Studio. And likewise, we have the same thing on a file system. In this case, just a local file system. This could be an NFS mount, it could be a HDFS file system, an S3 bucket, or ADLS storage. So we will create two data sources to these, and we will create the path effectively for the read. So being able to see objects inside of Postgres. And we're going to do this by creating a specific schema called datasets Postgres inside of TDV that Team Studio will see that will be used to read datasets from Postgres. Likewise, we will create a schema that will allow us to write data back through TDV into the schema that we've nominated for the output of the Team Studio workflows. And we'll replicate the same process to a file system as well. So to do this, we need to go back into TDV, and we need to be able to create data sources. Now, to do this, I'm going to create a new folder, which I simply do by right-clicking on Shared and saying New Folder, which I will call Data Sources. Inside of that folder, we need to add a data source. If I right-click on the folder and say New, and then go down to Data Source, you'll see under the box that TDV has a wide variety of different data connectors. These are not just relational databases, but they can be things like non-SQL databases, they can be files, they can be REST services, applications. In all cases, we can read from these sources, and a subset of them we'll be able to write back to as well. In this case, we initially want to do Postgres. So I select the Postgres driver, and we need to fill out some details here. First of all, let's give this a meaningful name. We need to give the IP address of the or the host name of the server that we're connecting to. The port, which I'll leave as a default here. The database I'm connecting to is called HTM, and I'm going through the user Postgres. We then hit this button here called Create an Interspect. And what this will do is this will connect to the server, and it will look inside of the server and see what schemas are available and what tables are available. So I can see here this public schemas where I want to read my data from. So I'm going to select all 4 tables. And for the write, I just want to pick a table so that we can bring in the schema that we want to write to. So this will actually now collect the metadata for this data source. And you can see now this data source allows me to query that data inside of TDV. We now need to make that data available to Team Studio. And as I showed in the diagram, what we want to do is create an input and output schema to do that. So if I go to the data source, which Team Studio is looking at, and create a new schema, and let's call this data sets. Postgres, and then we'll do one for the write, which we'll call compute Postgres, as it's the output of computations. Okay, so I can now publish my data sets that I want to read to the read schema, the data sets one. And these will now be visible inside of Team Studio. So if we go back inside of the Team Studio product, and now if I refresh this here, you'll see those schema appear. And you can see we can go to datasets Postgres. There's my table. And I can actually now, for example, browse the data. Now for the write back, there is one more process that we have to do, which is to tell TDV where when we create tables against this compute schema where to actually send the data. And we do this by adding a little configuration to that data source. If I open up the data object, and you'll see there's a tab here called Composite DDL. See, there's one already set up which mustn't be modified or changed again. That's used internally by Team Studio. What I'll do is add my pass-through, which is to say, okay, when it comes from this compute Postgres schema, I want you to send the data to and create tables in the schema inside of Postgres called Team Studio. Okay, I just save that configuration. So this allows us to write data back, and let's just test this inside of Team Studio. What I'll do here is I'll create a new workflow, and let's call this workflow test writes. And I need to select the Spark system that we're going to use for computation and the TDB source for writing back data. So now inside of that workflow, I can see that same data that was published through from TDV. So if I go to my data sets, there's one of the tables. Let's take this product table and let me add an operator on here. Let's do a column filter. And what we're going to do here is we're going to just take some of the columns. So let's just take the first 3, for example. And now, by selecting the output schema to be compute Postgres, it will mean that I write a table which has this cryptic name back to TDB and ultimately to Postgres. So now if I run this workflow, we should see the data being written. Okay, so that workflow is run. We can see the data appearing here and the data appearing here. If I go back into TDV, what we will see now is under the compute, we will see an object called Alpine, which is the 16 column filter 0, which is the cryptic name. And if I look at the lineage of this, which actually shows us where the data is coming from, you'll see that goes right back to Postgres. If I look at Postgres, you'll see that table has appeared. So we've written the data all the way back through. So now we want to repeat that process, this time for a file system. A reason for showing this is the file systems do behave a little bit differently inside TDV. Okay, so let's create our file data source. So again, under the data sources folder here, if I right click, and I'm going to create a new file-based data source. So new data source. And I'm going to use the local file system here. But as I said, this could be an S3 bucket, it could be HDFS, it could be Azure Data Lake Storage. So again, let's give it a meaningful name. And I give it the URL where the data resides. In my case, a folder called data. Now here we need to change some of the settings in the advanced tab. First of all, we want the size of the default string to be 32 kilobytes, the biggest that we can allow. We want in the CSV area to allow a header row and infer schema. And we want to change the null indicator to be square bracket null. Okay, now we hit the create and Interspect button and we now see the underlying file system. I want the output folder and I'm going to take a couple of input sets from here. Let's take product and let's take plot. So now it will bring the metadata in, very similar to the database. Okay, again, I can see the output here. And again, we can now publish. So what I'll do this time is I'll create 2 new folders. One for the read of files. So let's call this data sets file. And create the write, which will be compute file. I can publish those to the read, so the datasets file, and we can set the DDL pass through for the writes back to the file system for the file based. So if I browse here and pick compute file, and then go to the location that we want. Okay, so we're all now set up to use files as well. So if I go back into Studio and now in my workflow and refresh this, you'll see those new schema have appeared. So if I take datasets file as being my input, and let's take again product from there. Notice it's got the CSV extension on it. Let me create a column filter for this. Again, let's take the 3 columns. Now this time I select the different schema. I take the compute file and I use that as my target. So now I'm going to tell it to write to the file system instead of writing to the database. So again, if I run this operator through. Okay, so that's now run. Now I can see the data from the data source and after the filter. And now if I go back and look inside of TDV, what we'll see here is under compute file, we now created a new object, and that has created in turn a entry in my output directory here as a Parquet file, writing the data back through from Team Studio. So that really completes all the configuration. This is a kind of a one-off activity. Obviously, if you need to add new data sets, that would have to be done inside of TDV Studio. There is one more configuration, which we have the ability to write data directly to the file system. At the moment, everything is going through TDV. But if we tell the Spark, which is actually running the jobs from Team Studio, that there is a shared file system that can be seen both by Spark and can be seen by TDV, then rather than pushing everything through TDV, read and write directly to that file system. So in this way, only the thing that goes through TDV is just metadata to tell where that file is. All the input, output, all the data movement that's done from Spark is done directly to the file system, and the created file is just published through TDV into Team Studio, so that Team Studio is aware of its presence. Now, to do this, we simply have to take the URL we did for that file system, so this file data, and we just configure it as a parameter inside of Team Studio. And we do this on the Spark data source. So we go back to the data sources and we go to the Spark and we say edit data source. And you'll see that there's these additional parameters. We add this one here called data shared volumes, and we change it to be the name of that volume that we just got inside of TDV. And that will now tell Team Studio Spark to actually go directly to the file system. So that really completes the configuration. There are just a few more things to mention, probably around performance. With this, there's some optimizations that we can do. The first thing is the version of TDV that's being used should not be clustered. And this is to do with the fact that there's lots of updates to the metadata. So if you do have a clustered environment, you'll need to have another TDV instance used by Team Studio. The other thing is it's worth configuring the memory out of the box. The memory for TDV is only 2 gigabytes. This can be increased by going to the configuration, going to server, going to memory, and then Java heap. And then here you can increase the amount of memory given to the TDV server. It shows you how much is available to you. This does require you to restart TDV to take place. The other thing that can also happen is TDV tries to maintain correct queries to data sources around case sensitivity and trading spaces. And this can sometimes conflict with the data source. So for example, if I go to the data source here, the Postgres, and you will see here, if I go to the Info tab, that the settings are actually optimal. If they were not, you can actually, again, change them through the Configuration tab here, and you go to the SQL engine, and you will look for SQL language, and here is the case sensitivity and trading space settings. If they don't match a database, you can reverse them so that they do. So that completes the use of TDV inside of Team Studio. I hope this video has been useful for you. Please follow other videos on our site for more information.